Hey guys, what's up? It's Megan, and today we're on day 6 of our 7 days of yoga for the beginning practitioner. And today we're going to go over modifications. And so I've got a few props here in front of me. So one of which is just a bath towel. That's something that everybody should have in their home, obviously. I have a yoga block. This you may or may not already have purchased. If you haven't, I would recommend getting one. They have the skinnier ones and they have the thicker ones. I kind of like the skinnier ones myself, but you could use either or. And then I have a strap as well. So if you didn't have the strap, you could use, a belt or some kind of piece of fabric in substitution. I mean, the block is pretty much, you need a block, but you can get away with using something like a cushion or a towel for certain things. But the block is just good to have around. I would recommend getting that if you haven't already done so. In the practice, we're going to come to certain poses where oftentimes a practitioner will need to modify and use some type of device to help assist them to reach the full benefit of the pose. And so today I'm going to start with something simple as just sitting. And so whenever we come to we say a comfortable seat in a yoga class, that can be hard for people to just simply find a comfortable seat. And so we've got the block and we have the towel as props. So we can use either of these two. So I'm sitting right now on my knees, and that for everybody wouldn't be ideal. For some folks it would be better. So we're going to show a couple variations. So one of which is going to be Virasana with the block. So this will give a bit of a prop here. The knees are in line with the head of the thigh bones, and the tops of the feet are released down to the mat, the floor. So I place the sitting bones on top of the block, and I move the flesh of the glutes out from under, and then there's a lengthening of the spine. From here, we could choose to hold this variation, or again, another option would be Sukhasana, the seated cross-legged variation with a block. And I really use this with all of my students, but especially if you were to come to a seat and you see people where they've got really tight hips and their posture looks more like this, and I'm going to ask them to use a block, use something like a rolled up mat or towel to prop underneath the sitting bones, moving the flesh of the glutes so we create more of the anterior tilt to the pelvis. Okay, so yoga block, towel, blanket, some type of prop for a seated position is ideal. Okay, so that's going to be our first modification. Moving on to next, it would be coming into, let's say, something like the all fours position. So for some people, if they've had a knee surgery or they just have sensitive knees, the knees can be a little bit vulnerable here. So for one of which I know some of my students, they like to practice doubling up mats. So this is just kind of a standard size width of a mat. So some of my students will choose to put two mats, so one on top of the other. Also, you can purchase mats that are a little bit thicker or heavier duty, so that will give you a little bit more cushioning. And then the other would be to use, again, your towel, fold it up. You can place it under the knees if you're asked to hold an all fours variation for any period of time and you find that to be a little bit uncomfortable. So we can use, again, the towel or a mat as a prop for this. So all fours, again, placing under the knees. And so another thing that we'll come into is that people who have, let's say, wrist problems, or maybe they've had a broken wrist or a previous injury, and placing their hands like so in what we call bright hands could be painful and difficult. So another thing that we can do is come up onto what we call ridge tops. So ridge tops is going to be like the tippy toes for your hands. So we come up onto the ridge tops, and this will help to take pressure out of the wrist. So this is a good modification for somebody who's maybe, again, had a previous injury, a fracture, carpal tunnel syndrome, or anything that might prohibit them from feeling comfortable in traditional alignment with the hands. Another way that we can work this is taking our towel and we can roll it up like so. So a little bit of a roll there, and then I can place my hands to the rolled up towel, so just the heel of the hand basically. And so some people find this to be another kind of helpful modification if they've had wrist injuries. I personally prefer the ridge tops. I just feel that it achieves really more of the goal and the purpose, and it's just less cumbersome. So I prefer more of the ridge tops, but we can use something like the towel rolled up underneath the wrists if necessary. Okay, so moving on from there. So anytime, again, any pose that we would be in where you're asked to bring your knees down to the floor, you can always use bringing a towel to class or to your practice. Another thing that we can work is folding the mat kind of like so to give a little extra cushion. Will be one variation. And then we can also flip the mat lengthwise as well to provide a bit of cushioning if necessary. Okay. So moving on from here, I'm going to come into crouching cat. So again, or pardon, down. I say crouching cat. It's downward dog. I teach crouching cat as well in another style of yoga, but for today's purpose we're going to come back to downward facing dog. So in downward dog, a modification that I've been talking about through this 7-day sequence is bending the knees. All right, so as we bend the knees, this will be a modification for traditional alignment in downward facing dog. So why we would bend the knees, we've gone over it already, but the reason is because if I'm working with straight legs and I get into a rounding spine here at the lumbar, then I'm going to be losing the engagement, the intention to keep the spine long. So I would just have the beginning practitioner bend the knees in downward dog as a modification. Okay, so that's going to be our first downward dog modification, which we've already talked about. And now I'm going to step the right foot forward, and I'm going to come to Parshvakonasana. So this is another place that will need a block oftentimes for people. So I place the block to the outer side, outer edge of the foot. So I'm going to use the block like so. You can't even bring it up even higher if you're unable to touch the earth. And so this is, again, another common modification that we would need in a variation like Parshvakonasana. Okay. Moving on, Trikonasana, straightening the leg. So this is a place where I see a lot of times that the practitioner is unable to touch down to the earth. And so in this case, we would just use the block. Okay, moving on from here, we can come to Ardha Chandrasana. This is another variation that you see quite often where people, they have a hard time. So I would just ask them to use the block to give them a little extra lift, a little extra support. And all of these poses we've been doing throughout the sequence, previous sequences, and so you'll see some repetition here, which is good. As a beginning practitioner, that's one of the best ways to learn is to repeat over and over again. So we're going to touch down to standing splits now. So this is another place where I can use my block. So really any time that we're in a pose where we're having a hard time touching down to the foundation. Okay, so from standing splits, I come to Uttanasana. I place my feet. So here we are, feet roughly hip width distance apart, parallel. I bend the knees. I send the inner thighs back. I look forward, and then I use my block. So I can keep my hands to the block again. You can also place it upright vertically if you need a little extra lift. But always just bend the knees a bit so that we're not rounding again, which is what you see most commonly in forward folds with beginner practitioners. Okay, so thigh bones back, heart and throat open, then we bow. Okay, I'm going to keep my block handy, placing my hands to the mat. I'll step my right foot back. We'll just go over the previous poses for balance and equanimity. So we've got Parshvakonasana here. So I've got my block to the outer edge of the foot. The right arm extends. And you want to press down, so you're rooting down, pressing down into the block in order to rise. And then Trikonasana, triangle variation. So again, we have our block, allowing us a little extra support and lift. And then we transition to Ardha Chandrasana. We'll step in, placing the block. And the block in this variation should be up and out even a bit from the front of the mat. And then I touch down, I use my block once again for standing splits. 2 hips in one line. And then lowering the right, coming back to Uttanasana. Inhaling, lengthen. Exhale, bow. And another place will be Parsvottanasana, so I'm going to step my left foot back. So it's a shorter stance, and so I see this a lot of times. It's a hamstring opener where people just can't touch down from here. They couldn't come all the way here. So I'd have them use the block, just placing it to the very front of the space, looking forward, pressing down through the big toe, top of the shin bone forward, head of the thigh bone back. And then we step the left foot forward and the right foot back. Lengthen the spine, full breath. Exhaling, fold. Inhaling, lengthen. And then step the right foot back to meet the left, placing the block to the front of the mat. Inhale, lengthen the spine. Exhaling, bow. Okay, the block you can also place between the shins. And this just is a good place for us to work on hugging in, drawing in muscularly. So it's just a way that we can kind of allow for the legs to wake, and using a little bit of a prop to create more awareness. So we can use the block between the shins here. There's one variation where we would use the prop as well. And then inhale, rise, coming up, and then sit down, Utkatasana chair. Good, and then exhale, fold. Touching the earth. Inhaling, lengthen. Exhaling, bow. Step the left foot back. Lower the left knee to the mat. I'm going to place the block out to the outer side of the mat, coming up to the hands to the tops of the thighs. Inhaling, the left arm will lift, and then crescenting over to the right. And so this would be an opportunity where we could use the block, just pressing down into the block in order to create, again, more stability, more balance. And then release, come on back. Block to the front of the space. We can then straighten the front leg, coming into Hanumanasana variation prep. And so we have the block here. It would be helpful, again, if you're unable to touch the floor, then you can use the block. And then release. Placing the hands, step back. Left foot forward. Lowering now the right knee, placing the block to the outside of the mat. Inhaling, right arm, and then we crescent over. So again, we would use the block as a little bit of a support if we are unable to touch the floor with the fingertips. And then release, coming back. Touch down. We straighten the leg and using the block for support, the foundation. Back toes curling under. We look forward. Top of the shin bone still pressing forward, avoiding hyperextension. Extend out through the big toe. And then release. Placing the hands, coming back to downward facing dog. Come down to the knees. Okay, so So we are going to go over a few seated poses, which is where we'll tend to need the block or the props quite a bit more so and when we come down to the floor. So one of the big things that you'll see most commonly with people, especially if they're newer to the practice or have, kind of tighter hamstrings and such, is that when I have them come to a seated position, you tend to get this kind of energy that happens, right? Or I'll ask them to do a pose like this and they're like, okay. So what I would do for one is if I'm having them come into a seat and they're already tending to really round in their lumbar, I would have them use a blanket or the towel just rolled up, placed underneath of the sitting bones. So I prefer this over the block in these variations. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing the flesh of the glutes back and creating the anterior tilt to the pelvis. So for a pose like Janu Shirshasana here, bringing left foot in to inner right thigh, right foot out, I bring the blanket or the towel underneath of the pelvis again to prop, creating more anterior tilt to the pelvis. Then I can come forward. So someone who's here, right, I might have them use then a strap so that they could really work on holding the proper alignment of the spine as they come forward. Okay? So another one that the block will come in with the next variation is right forearm. I'll say, oh, bring your right forearm to the outside of the mat, to the outside of the thigh. And, again, someone will look kind of like this, right? So I'd ask them, please place your forearm to the block and then extend out. Okay. And we'll just do the other side quickly. So again, we stay balanced here. So left leg forward, right leg back. So moving the flesh of the glutes, again, we encourage the anterior tilt to the pelvis. You can also have a student, or you could, as a student, you can bend your knee as well. That's another little modification that you might want to bring in if the hamstrings are really tight. And it's really challenging for you to work with the legs straight. Okay, again, we use the strap, lengthening, and then bowing here, we lead with the heart. And then release. And then again, we place the block to the outside of the thigh, extending. And then release. And so, again, in 20 minutes, we can only go over so much, but that gives you a general idea of any time basically you need to fold into a pose or you can't touch down, then that's where the block would come in. You'd use a block to give you a little bit of extra lift. The strap will come in. We didn't go into binds and all that because this is a very beginner sequence that we've been going over, and so I didn't introduce binds and such at this moment. That would probably be in a later sequence. But the strap would come in, as a modification in binds and things of this nature as well. Forward folds where you might need to use a little bit of leverage without rounding. And then the other key component is like a bath towel or a little blanket that you could use for padding the knees, for underneath the heels of the hands, and then also just for support in any seated pose. So we just did one seated variation, but if you were doing any other seated variations that may require a lift, it would be the same exact thing. You would just put it under the sitting bones and create an anterior tilt to the pelvis. All right, so again, we went over modifications today, and we're going to wrap it up with tomorrow's final sequence, which will be a flow, just bringing everything together. And so thanks so much for checking it out, and have a great day. Ciao.